Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the Great Santa Claus Switch from 1970. Now, this is kind of the beginning of an annual tradition I want to do, because when I was doing my every Jim Henson Company show ever, I noticed there are a lot of Christmas specials in there, and I was curious about them. I wanted to watch them, frankly. I thought it'd be a cool thing to every Christmas season do a Christmas special. I thought I would start this tradition with the very first Jim Henson Christmas special, which would be the Great Santa Claus Switch from 1970. Now, this is an interesting place in Muppet history because this comes out right after Sesame Street has premiered. Sesame Street is just starting to build acclaim and recognition in the industry. Although he had been on talk shows and Sam and Friends and done a lot of commercials, he was known, but this really gave him the ability to get projects made. And the Great Santa Claus Switch was a project he had been developing for a long time. Apparently there's sketches all the way back to 1963 about this project, and he really wanted to make it. And so because he had been on the Ed Sullivan Show so many times, a lot of times, and Ed Sullivan had always been a fan of Jim Henson and liked what was going on with Sesame Street, I feel like, not sure, but definitely like the Muppets, decided to make this special in his time slot on December 20th, 1970s, which would have been the last Ed Sullivan Show before Christmas. Instead of airing an Ed Sullivan Show episode that day, they just aired this, which is a big deal because Ed Sullivan was a huge show. I don't know the history of the popularity or if it was a peak time or whatever. This was way after the Beatles. That's pretty much all I know about the Ed Sullivan Show, being a child of baby boomers, and I don't think I've ever watched a full episode of the Ed Sullivan Show, frankly, but I know it was a big deal, and this airing in that slot would have been a big deal, and that's thus why Ed Sullivan is introducing it and has a few segments throughout it. And this is actually directed by John Moffat, who regularly directed the Ed Sullivan Show, as well as directed a ton of TV after this, but that's his kind of connection to this special. Ed Sullivan even appeared on the cover of TV Guide with the Muppets to promote this special. So clearly, this was a highly promoted thing. Jim Henson was a bigger deal. Apparently Big Bird appeared on the cover of Time, I think November of 1970. So this was a peak. There would be bigger peaks, I guess, but this was starting to become a huge mainstream thing that Jim Henson and the Muppets and Sesame Street and all those things. So this was obviously kind of the big promoted Christmas special that season. And Jim Henson had wanted this to become something that regularly aired and become a big deal. You always hear about that with Christmas specials, but I understand it more when you think of the date, which we probably should, the context of when this was released, because most of the Christmas specials that we all watch every year, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and a Charlie Brown Christmas special, whatever it's called, most of them premiered in the late 60s, pretty close to one another. So the idea that you could have a special that people would love and would re-air year after year after year was something that was, very much a current thing. They weren't that old. So I sort of understand if people were hey, maybe we can do what those guys did. Jim Henson felt he could. And the thing about the Great Santa Claus Switch is I like it. At the beginning, I sort of didn't get why I haven't seen this as much. I'd heard about it on the Defunctland Jim Henson documentary series, which initially piqued my interest for it and made me interested to see it. But I was wondering why this doesn't get replayed a lot. And I don't think, by the way, that it is terrible or anything like that. It has a lot of cool things about it. But the main plot of this is, the idea that an evil witch called Cosmo Sam, played by Art Carney, decides to kidnap Santa Claus, also played by Art Carney, to kidnap him and be able to break into every home in the world and steal things from them. And he steals Santa Claus, and he has a bunch of elves who are, of course, Muppets, and steals Santa Claus. And Santa Claus, obviously, I think the plot of this is not as interesting, really, but there are certain things that are interesting about it and things that develop from it. But yeah, I guess I sort of understand why this didn't become a yearly thing to a certain regard, but I also don't think it's that bad. I think people overly talk about well, I get why this wasn't a yearly thing or whatever, but it's definitely not the worst thing in the world. I liked, the kind of various premise of it. I sort of like the idea that Art Carney is playing both parts. Not sure how they did the thing where they walk around each other. I'm sure because he's wearing a full Santa Claus outfit. When he's Santa Claus, you kind of can't tell the difference. I generally like Art Carney. I'm a fan of the Honeymooners. So that was fun, and I think he had more fun playing Cosmo Scam, which I think was probably a much better part to play, but he seemed to like playing off of one another. But there are certain concepts and ideas that come from this that I think have become a bigger thing, and things this special started. But again, like I think this is kind of just a fine Christmas special. I liked it for like kind of seeing things develop and so forth. What this really brought through the production of this is they had to hire additional puppeteers, being Richard Hunt, who had become a major puppeteer in the Muppet kind of stuff and productions, and then Fran Brill, who was the first female puppeteer after Jim Henson's wife had left. So she's kind of the first one, I guess, who wasn't Jim Henson's wife. Them working with Jim Henson for the first time is a big deal, as well as Gonzo shows up as one of the Frackles. Cosmoscan has these thing called the Frackles. That's Frackles, not Fraggles, but the idea that Frackles may have influenced Fraggles is definitely in your mind, because they definitely sound very similar, as Frackles is F-R. Anyway, they're spelled differently, but you get the point. Gonzo being one of the Frackles, or the design of Gonzo, because one of the things Jim Henson always did is that regardless of who he was making these specials for, he would own all the rights to the character design, so then he could use them again later, which was smart of him. So he used Gonzo appears in this as kind of the I guess cigar box Frackle, and he pops out, and it's not Gonzo's voice, but it is definitely a design that would definitely become Gonzo later. And then the two henchmen for Cosmoscam are Thig and Thong. Thong would later appear in, the Muppets opening, the Muppet Show Tonight, and even up to the Jason Segel, the Muppets, more recently. That is another character we've seen in a lot of things. I'm sure there's others in the background that I couldn't find information on, but I think if you are a Muppet fan or your kids are fans of the Muppets, it is definitely worth watching for that, and it's on YouTube. It's sadly, I couldn't find much info if it ever aired again. I know it's at the Paley Center has it, apparently, and it is on YouTube in full, or at least it was when I made this video, and then on YouTube in several parts as well. Apparently there's not a DVD, and I don't know if it's ever been officially released. It should. It's good enough for that. Some streaming service, whoever has the rights, or I think the Ed Sullivan Studios has the rights, they should restore it and give it a good home, because it's definitely worth that. I liked hearing, like, even the elf that it's his first Christmas and he's all excited, remind me a lot of Ernie and Jim Henson's performance of that. I like the whole premise of like slowly replacing the elves and throwing them in a cell because they knew something was up, and then replacing them with the Frackles, which is like a really cool thing. You can see ideas for the Dark Crystal and other ambitious designs going throughout. Certain of the henchmen in Cosmoscan's kind of cave there, you can definitely see we're not like, actually going to help him do anything, but to be honest, like, it's sort of a silly premise, so I don't mind them just looking cool and doing a cool dance and doing a cool design. I quite enjoyed that. So I came into this as like a fun little Christmas special. I didn't come into, I was aware that this was obscure. I was aware of like it hadn't been released a lot. Part of me wondered why that was, and in the initial beginnings of it, I sort of got why that was. It's a little cliched. The whole thing of the magic of Christmas and like Santa being a magician was an interesting kind of, or doing magic tricks was an interesting touch to it. I like their interpretation of Santa and what they did with that character, and having one person play both I thought was kind of a cool idea. And I think they did a lot with making the Santa Claus switch kind of uniquely theirs, but I don't think it shows enough to a lot of people. A Santa Claus switch, obviously, apparently it's even been done. Frank Baum did one in the early 20th century, and Never Before Christmas, which would obviously be after, and it's been done a lot of times, so I guess it isn't that unique, that idea of it. But what is unique is Jim Henson doing it and this interpretation of it. This would obviously be something that was widely seen at the time, but I do wish it was more available now, because I don't think a lot of people remember it. It's not the most memorable one, and that's probably why it's not your Emmett Otters or your Muppet Family Christmas or something like that. But it is, if you're into those and you've ever wanted to watch another one, I think it would be a good watch, and I think it would be a lot of fun. So under that, I would just say it's simply sort of an okay special, but what it brought about and what it kind of helped bring in and help introduce Jim Henson to the holiday season, which I think they've done amazing things with. In that regard, I think the influence of this special and what it has done is greater probably than the special itself, but watching the special itself is a fine enough time that it's worthy to go down if you are into the Muppets. I'm not sure if you're not, but I don't think you'd have a really bad time either. It's an alright special. They do a lot with kind of a simple kind of premise, and it kind of shows you maybe that their interpretation and use of Muppets and puppets throughout this, and Art Carney, kind of shows you all the talent they have, that they can make this a lot more interesting and not make me just get totally bored by another Christmas special doing the same thing. I was kind of like interested and kind of more involved in as a viewer than I think I necessarily would be. They took a flat premise and elevated it. I don't know if they elevated it too much beyond that, but I still had a good enough time watching it just this once. I don't know if I'll watch it again, but I recommend you at least get to check it out once, because it's definitely worth that chance to watch The Great Santa Claus Switch. So if you have seen The Great Santa Claus Switch and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And Merry Christmas.